Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses Slovak lawmakers, says sixth package of sanctions from EU is needed.
Germany's foreign minister arrives in Ukraine, becoming the highest-ranking German official to visit the country since Russia's invasion began.
Plus, Prince Charles delivers the Queen's speech in Parliament for the first time, setting out the government's agenda for the coming year.
Hello again. Ukraine's president has called for EU member states to approve a proposed sixth package of sanctions against Russia, which includes an embargo on oil imports from the country. President Volodymyr Zelensky told Slovakia's parliament in a video address that the sixth package of sanctions is certainly a package that's needed. EU proposals are still being considered by member states.
Meanwhile, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock arrived Ukraine today, becoming the highest-ranking German government official to visit the country since Russia's invasion. Her first stop was in the town of Bucha, near Kyiv, where Russian forces are accused of having committed war crimes. The German Foreign Minister has also said Ukraine should become a full member of the European Union at some point, but also says there could be no shortcut to membership. Meanwhile, according to the World Health Organization, at least 3,000 people have died in Ukraine because they had been unable to access treatments for chronic diseases. The WHO's European chief, Hans Kluge, told a regional meeting in Copenhagen, attended by 53 member states, that so far the Global Health Agency has documented some 200 attacks in Ukraine's healthcare facilities, and few hospitals are currently functioning.
That's right. WHO officials said last week they were gathering evidence for possible war crimes investigation into these attacks. During the meeting, attended by many virtually, WHO members also said they plan to consider measures against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, including possible closure of a major regional office in Moscow. We'll have that report a bit later. In the meantime, an ex-fighter for the Wagner Group has turned down an invitation to fight in Ukraine, guessing that the mission could end up in failure. According to the former mercenary with the Kremlin-linked Wagner Group, who fought alongside the Russian army, the Russian military's failure to seize the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is inevitable because in the preceding years they had never directly faced a powerful enemy.
And talking about Russia's setbacks, he said they were caught completely by surprise that the Ukrainian army resisted so fiercely and that they faced the actual army. He added that people he spoke to on the Russian side had told him they expected to face ragtag militias when they invaded Ukraine, not well-drilled regular troops. Gabidulin took part in Wagner Group missions on the Kremlin's behalf in Syria and in a previous conflict in Ukraine before deciding to go public about his experience inside the secretive private military company.
We are joining us now, former ambassador, former permanent secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi. He is in Abuja. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the program this evening.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Ambassador, we're in the third month of this war, and Russian attacks have intensified, especially over Mariupol and the Azovstal steel plants. We'd have had, seen those pictures in the reports, which we'll be showing in a minute. But would you consider taking control of Mariupol a consolation prize for the Russian president, Vladimir Putin?
I don't know whether Putin itself would consider it a consolation prize. He has, its army has virtually destroyed the city. And you begin to wonder whether that was the prize he set out to capture in the first instance. I don't think Mariupol was the major prize when this war started. But I think over time it has become part of the larger goal of Putin to seize from Crimea, the ports, and then to Mariupol. So it might just be for a short while a consolation prize, but in reality, I don't really think it will be anything of a consolation prize. And by the way, he has not gotten the whole of Mariupol. Everybody knows there's still some resistance, and nobody knows what could happen tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed, no one knows what will happen tomorrow, but many leaders yesterday during the Victory Day, the celebrations across Europe, did say that Russia had failed, in Ukraine. The fact that it's in the third month and they still haven't gotten what they want, they still haven't run over the country. Ukraine is still strong, the army is still fighting, putting up that resistance against the Russian army, and then all of the support that Ukraine is getting, from these countries. But EU leaders are at it again, this time preparing a sixth package of sanctions against Russia. Hungary is the only one holding them back at this point. How do you think that the reactions against Russia have tipped the global balance that we're seeing, especially economically and diplomatically?
Not much in the sense that if you go by various reports, the Russian economy is expected to contract by about 10%, possibly next year. There's no doubt that the sanctions will definitely hit Russia at some point in time. But until the European Union or the supporters of Ukraine, take the bold step of going after the major thing that will make Russia feel the impact of or the madness of going into this war, oil and gas. Until that is done, I don't think it will impact on Russia itself. But on the global side, look, the Russians have their supporters, or even if they are not openly supporting Russia, they have not openly supported Ukraine. So the balance of power, the globe is divided, it's not tilting one way or the other, but certainly everybody has sympathy today for Ukraine, more because of the massive and senseless destruction that the Russians have inflicted on the country itself. So I don't think that a lot has tilted in any direction, but I think that at the end of it all, we might see a shift. Particularly now that countries like Finland, are considering joining NATO. I watched an interview on BBC this morning by a commentator who actually didn't make much sense, but he was ready to accept that Finland could join NATO, but certainly they are not prepared to allow Ukraine to join NATO. And that tells you that there is more to the reasons why Putin decided to invade Ukraine. It's not all about territories. If it's all about territories, I have repeatedly said, you are holding the territories, so you don't have to go to war to capture territories that you are holding. The second thing is, if you want the whole country itself, must you destroy it? When you destroy it, who are you going to govern?
Ambassador Keir, and we did hear from the Finnish Parliament's Defence Committee that they are recommending NATO membership as the best option for the country to guarantee its security. So, meaning there might be an expected official decision sometime this week. We also heard the French president say it could take months, even years, for Ukraine to join the EU. But now that Ukraine is enjoying all this support from European allies and also submitted that questionnaire, what do you think in terms of its membership into the 27 nation? Do you think it should be delayed? Do you think there's reason for it to still go ahead with that?
To your first question about Finland membership or application to join NATO, no matter how the Russians pretend, I think, again, they are beginning to see the consequences of their own action. Now you have more NATO troops, very close to the Russian border because of the fear that the Russians have created by the invasion of Ukraine. So they now have to blame themselves for what they've done to create fears among neighboring states who are now eager to join NATO. As to the second part of your question, whether it will take, whether it will be quick or it will be long, and why Ukraine will not have, Finland will not have an automatic, or Ukraine will not have an automatic. It is because these are countries that play by the rules of the game. There are criteria set out that you need to fulfill before you become either a member of NATO or a member of EU. Look, these are not countries like us. For example, let me just give you an example of what we do. PDP can't remember that it has zoning in its constitution. The people in the CBN can't remember the acts. They are looking for judges to help them understand the acts. No, these are not how democratic, law-abiding nations behave. So you see what they are saying indirectly is, yes, we have received your application, but we are going to follow the process to the letter. If it's A1A, if we have to do A, B, C, D, this is what the law says you need to fulfill before you join NATO or EU. They are simply going to follow it to the letter. And that's the difference. Invariably, look, 60-something% of the Finnish are in support of joining NATO. So the process is it's really given, for the simple reason that as long as they fulfill all the conditions and the process, they will have no cause to fear about whether they become a member today or tomorrow.
But Ambassador, that's also a similar poll. When we heard about the Ukrainians, about 50-something% were also in support of joining NATO. But looking at Russia, Russia isn't happy with Finland and Sweden going about this process. Do you think this will aggravate it even more?
No, you see, the point I'm trying to make is there's something more to aggravate. This is the consequences of not thinking through before you invaded Russia. This is the consequences of also not thinking through before you invaded Crimea, before you invaded Georgia. Because when you took over Crimea and then you invaded Georgia and then you took one or two other countries before the war, look, people around Russia, other states around Russia, they are looking at what Russia is doing to Ukraine. And the fear is what is driving them to become member of NATO. Article 5 of NATO says if you attack a member, you attack the whole region itself. You attack the whole members. And so people who want to join NATO today, it's as a result of the fears created by Russian behavior and the way it is dealing with Ukraine, and the way it has invaded Russia, and the way it has taken over Crimea. So nobody is sure, and everybody wants to protect themselves from the Russian bear, and that's why they all want to be member of NATO. It's very simple and rational when you come to think of it.
Yeah, and the rest of the world is bearing the consequences of the invasion, aren't we? One of the consequences, of course, is the global food crisis that's looming, and EU leaders have been discussing with the Ukrainian president about that, immediate measures to unblocking Ukraine's ports for grain exports. Before the war, Ukraine was exporting about 4.5 million tons of agricultural produce per month through its ports. What immediate measures do you think could be taken to forestall this looming food shortage?
Look, for now, the only measure available is to bring the war to an end. Alternatively, if the West is serious, and I've made this point, if the West is serious, they will at some point, consider military action. Because look, this is going to affect everybody around the globe. Here in Nigeria, yesterday, somebody was, I think it was on your morning program, somebody was giving an example of the impact of the Ukrainian-Russian, war on the Nigerian economy itself. And it's affecting the whole globe. So somewhere along the line, something must give in. But let me also say this, that I must commend the Ukrainians. They really make me feel very proud in terms of both leadership and in terms of the commitment of the people. Could you believe that despite the Russian massive air bombardment, these fellows are going in, repairing the rail lines in order to be able to, of course, get in their hands as well as export the agricultural produce in order to survive. You know, so the world will suffer from this, and this is why somewhere along the line, I sincerely hope that the world will make a decision when to seriously intervene in this war and bring the war to an end.
Well, talking about the war coming to an end, President Putin, during his speech yesterday, never mentioned when the war will end. He praised his soldiers, he praised everyone else for defending the motherland. So when do you think this war could end? We're already in the 3rd month.
Amarachi, if Putin doesn't know, I don't know. You know, he went into war. I'm sure he had his game plan. And I think before I joined you, I'm sure that you were discussing the fact that, I don't know whether it was the Russians or somebody who was saying that they thought they were going to meet a ragtag army, but they are amazed. Yes, they are amazed by the resistance of the Russian, of the Ukraine, soldiers. And I remember on one of your programs, I have actually questioned the efficiency of the Russian intelligence. So if they are saying this now, you begin to wonder exactly whether the Russians were properly prepared for this war, or they just decided on impulse of their leader to teach Ukraine a lesson, which is what this is all about.
Ambassador Joe Keshi, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you. Pleasure here. Thank you, too. Thank you.
Let's bring you a wrap of events happening in Ukraine today.
A crew of firefighters was today deployed to the site of missile strikes in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa, where 1 person was killed and 5 others injured. Spokeswoman of Ukraine's Operational Command South, Natalia Humeniuk, told the media that 7 missiles were launched in the direction of a shopping center and a depot. Video footage from the scene showed smoke billowing and rescue workers combing through piles of rubble.
По Одесі було нанесено черговий ракетний удар.
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has toured the Kiev suburb of Bucha and said, "These victims could be us." The foreign minister said this after making an unannounced visit to Ukraine, where she likened the Kiev suburb to the Berlin suburb of Potsdam, where she lived with her family, saying,
Diese Opfer, auch das spürt man hier so eindringlich.
"You can see playgrounds, supermarkets, you can see people going to work, and then you can see the worst traces of crimes just next to it. A bomb which hit the supermarket right in the middle."
Gentlemen from the media, the minister will give a brief statement.
According to Ukrainian authorities, more than 400 civilians were killed in Bucha. Amnesty International said last week there was compelling evidence that Russian troops had committed war crimes, including extrajudicial executions of civilians, where they occupied an area outside Ukraine's capital in February and March, when they occupied an area northwest of Kiev.
C'est en tout cas le but de la présidence française. On y travaille d'arrache-pied.
Meanwhile, French European Affairs Minister Clement Beaune has said that European Union members could reach a deal this week on EU Commission's proposal to ban all oil imports from Russia. He also added that French President Emmanuel Macron was due to talk with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán later in the day. Hungary is the most vocal critic of this planned embargo on Russian oil.
The bill provides another important tool in reference to...
The U.S. is also speeding up military aid to Ukraine with the signing of a present-day version of a lending program that helped defeat Hitler's Germany. The original Lend-Lease Act let Washington lend or lease weapons to its allies The new version will allow the same to Ukraine immediately. Before he signed the bill, President Biden said it was time again to form a global force for peace. The sole condition is repayment at some later date, and the policy will also help other Eastern European countries affected by Russia's invasion.
But caving to aggression is even more costly. That's why we're staying in.
Over in the UK, Prince Charles, representing the Queen at the opening of Parliament today, set out government legislative agenda outlining Prime Minister Boris Johnson's return to his election pledges to tackle regional inequalities across Britain and maximise its post-Brexit freedoms.
Prince Charles, who had attended the event in times past alongside his mother, wore an admiral's uniform to read out the agenda from a throne. And while the Queen would have announced, "My government will," the Prince said, "Her Majesty will." The Queen's speech set out 38 bills, including measures to revitalise Britain's high streets, crack down on illicit finance and make the city, London's financial district, more attractive to global investors after the country left the European Union.
And Buckingham Palace has announced yesterday that the Queen would not be presenting her speech to Parliament today, as Her Majesty has had a recurrence of mobility issues. It said her son, Prince Charles, accompanied by his eldest son, Prince William, will step in to replace her for the grand ceremony. The last time the Queen missed this sort of event was almost 6 decades ago. The world's oldest and longest reigning monarch recently spoke of her mobility issues in a meeting with the outgoing Defence Services Secretary of the Royal Household. She has been forced to cut back on engagements since being hospitalised for a night last October for an unspecified illness and then being told by her doctors to rest. The palace has declined to give details of the Queen's ailment, but a source says her decision to pull out of the opening of Parliament, which was only made yesterday, was related to the problems she suffered last year.
I'm here. I thought you did. I thought my Majesty stayed in there for ages. Good morning.
Good morning, Your Majesty. How are you?
Well, as you can see, I can't move.
Oh, well, many congratulations on the start of your Jubilee year.
Good morning.
To the politics of ruling the country, Labour Party leader Keir Starmer says he would resign if police decide he broke COVID-19 rules, putting pressure on Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's refused to step down after he was fined over a lockdown-busting party. After months of Johnson being criticised for attending parties at his Downing Street residence when Britain was in strict coronavirus lockdown, attention has turned to a gathering Starmer attended last year in the northeast of England. British police said on Friday they would investigate Starmer over a potential breach of the lockdown rules in 2021 after receiving significant new information. Footage from April 2021 shows him drinking a bottle of beer with colleagues indoors when such gatherings were banned if not essential for work.
They were separated from family and friends. First COVID lockdown, I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were followed at all times. I simply had something to eat while working late in the evening, as any politician would do days before an election. But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down. Ever since the first COVID lockdown, I've always followed the rules. In that time, the British people have made heart-wrenching sacrifices. People were left desperately lonely. They were separated from family and friends. Tragically, many were unable to see dying loved ones. This was a collective sacrifice. People were entitled to expect that politicians would follow the same rules as everyone else. When my mother-in-law passed away suddenly just before the lockdown, my wife and I were unable to provide her father with the support we wanted to afterwards, because we followed the rules.
Joining us now is our London correspondent, Juliana Olaika. Juliana, Let's begin with Keir Starmer, the man whose moment in the sun has come. He was one of the loudest voices, wasn't he, calling for resignation of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when it was found out that he had attended those lockdown parties. Why does he think that he stands in better light now by offering to resign?
Good afternoon, Amarachi. I'm not sure Sir Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer's supporters or the general public think that he stands in a better light, but they are pretty different investigations. I think, first of all, today Sir Keir Starmer in the House of Commons really looked like a wounded animal. And it is going to be really difficult for him to have any shred of credibility with the British public, not just because at this time there is a lot of disdain towards politicians, not just here in this country, but across the world. And also, really important to point out that Sir Keir Starmer was a former director of public prosecution. He is one of the most senior lawyers in this country, which is why he was knighted by the Queen. But he has had days of really damaging headlines, and this is all about, as you quite rightly outlined, Beergate or Keir Beer, as the footage has been described of. There was this gathering in April last year of between 15 and 30 Labour MPs or Labour aid workers who decided to order a curry at 10 p.m. Now, I think this is where the legal, however you will be able to try and ascertain what exactly happened. But at the time, the law did state that you were not allowed to socialise indoors unless you were socialising within your support bubble. Now, much further on in the law, it does also talk about campaigning. And we know that the reason why Sir Keir Starmer was in Durham at the time was because there was a by-election. So he was campaigning. And as he said in the statement that you just played, he wanted to eat. The staff were hungry and they decided to grab a curry. But the optics don't look good, especially as we had with the Prime Minister. There are a barrage of different commentary of Sir Keir Starmer talking about the Prime Minister and his conduct. And now he's been caught up in not the same thing, because let's be honest, the Prime Minister, we're talking about 30 parties in Downing Street, over 50 fixed penalty notices have been issued, and the Prime Minister was fined. And of course, Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister. Sir Keir Starmer is the leader of the opposition. He didn't make the law, but potentially he could have broken it.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister is obviously going nowhere, isn't he? So how would Starmer's resignation, if that happens, impact on the Labour Party and on Starmer's reputation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Amarachi, and one that lots of political commentators are trying to find an answer to, and we don't know. You know, Sir Keir, as well as the Deputy Labour leader, Angela Rayner, have said if they are fined, they will resign. And some said that wasn't fair, that he was trying to blackmail the police into not doing it, because we know the country is going through its own domestic crises at the moment and the Prime Minister hasn't resigned. But, you know, the Labour Party are quite divided. You've got New Labour run by Blairites, led by, of course, Sir Keir Starmer. And then you've got the old Labour, the old Red Wall. And already lots of political pundits are saying who could be his successor, with three big names, Lisa Nandy, who definitely has that Red Wall credibility. That would put Boris Johnson's to shame. There's also Wes Streeting, pretty young, 39-year-old Cambridge-educated New Labour Blairite. He's the Shadow Health Secretary, very popular with those from the working class parts of the country. And then, of course, there's Yvette Cooper, who is by far the most senior politician in the Labour Party, a former minister, because, of course, the Conservative Party have been in power for over a decade. So within Keir Starmer's top positions, there are only a few that have actually served in government. So there is lots of discussion about that. I think the public were a little bit disappointed with Sir Keir Starmer during the Partygate scandals and during the pandemic. They considered him a bit of a wet fish. He wasn't able to capitalise on all the wrongdoing of the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and the Prime Minister. But in recent times, just before this dreadful news broke on Friday afternoon, he had stood up. He seemed to have found his voice, but unfortunately, whether or not he is fined by the police, this investigation is likely to smear him for years to come.
And Julian, I remember we had that conversation on Friday. But moving on to the events of today, Prince Charles represented the Queen in Parliament. Is that a sign he will be taking on more of Her Majesty's duties as concerns about her health continue to grow?
Well, I think that's definitely going to be the case, Millicent. You know, it was a pretty disappointing, shall we say, a statement we received during the 11th hour last night by Buckingham Palace, just telling the public that Her Majesty the Queen would not be delivering the Queen's speech for the first time in almost 60 years due to her mobility issues. I think because the monarchy is held in such high regard in this country, with lots of support by the media, it does appear that recently they have tried to protect her. There's been very little information delivered to the public about the Queen's health, but over the past few months we have gradually seen the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, the Duke of Cambridge, Prince William taking on more and more of her duties, and today has been described as unprecedented and historic. It's certainly one for the history books, the fact that the heir to the throne delivered the statement on behalf of his mother. I think now, you know, there are just fingers crossed that next month during the Queen's Jubilee, that she will be able to participate as much as she can. There is so many events that have been arranged up and down the country. Of course, we're not expecting her to be at all of them, but I think, you know, that symbolic, iconic shot of the Queen standing at her balcony is wanted very much by the public. And so, you know, fingers crossed the 96-year-old will stay strong so she can celebrate her 70 years on the throne in style.
And Janina, how would you say, you know, how do you think the nation received Prince Charles's address, even though they were the Queen's words?
Yes, well, of course, you know, when it comes to the reopening of Parliament, these aren't the Queen's words. These are very much the words of Boris Johnson and the government, and it's read out on behalf of the government by the Queen, because she is the head of Parliament symbolically, although she is apolitical. So she doesn't set out the agenda. It's the government that set out the agenda for the next 12 months, which is what they have done so today. And of course, the levelling up agenda and the cost of living crisis took front and centre. Last week, we have the Bank of England suggesting that inflation could reach double digits by the end of this year. We're already seeing prices at a generation's high. Lots of people talking about a poverty crisis that this country hasn't seen in about 50 years. So the cost of living was very much high up on the agenda, and we are expecting the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to outline an emergency budget to help those families who are really struggling at the moment, at a time when some of the biggest companies that are trading in the UK are tripling and doubling their profits. So I think it was, I wouldn't say well received. The headlines tomorrow are most certainly going to be that symbolic picture of the Prince of Wales looking and staring down at his mother's crown as she couldn't be there in attendance. But the government have got so much to crack on with. And then, of course, we know that the Prime Minister is going to be making a trip to Scandinavia tomorrow in efforts to boost the support of the Ukrainian army.
And the British media can be quite brutal with their criticism of not just politics, but also of the royal family. Thanks again, Juliana. I switch gears now to Sri Lanka, where the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has called on authorities to prevent further violence and urged restraint and meaningful dialogue to address the grievances of the population amid the country's severe economic crisis. The High Commissioner has also called on authorities to prevent further violence and protect the right to peaceful assembly.
The severe economic crisis has made daily life a struggle for most Sri Lankans. It has also highlighted grievances which require national dialogue, deeper structural reforms. Bachelet said it has brought together people from various ethnicities, religions, to demand greater transparency, accountability and participation in democratic life.
In the meantime, Sri Lanka today is still reeling from yesterday's protests as discarded files and smashed equipment were littered in ransacked offices of government officials. Military troops also patrolled central Colombo, where 8 torched vehicles lay partially submerged in a lake. As the Indian Ocean nation battles its worst economic crisis in history, thousands of protesters have defied curfew to attack government figures, setting ablaze homes, shops and businesses belonging to ruling party lawmakers and provincial politicians. Sri Lanka's unprecedented economic crisis follows a pandemic that hit key tourism earnings, leaving the government grappling with rising oil prices and the impact of populist tax cuts.
Filipinos protested in Manila today after the Philippines election body upheld its earlier decisions that dismissed petitions to disqualify Ferdinand Marcos Jr. from the presidential race. Marcos, better known as Bongbong, trounced bitter rival Leni Robredo to become the first candidate in recent history to win an outright majority in a Philippines presidential election, marking a stunning comeback by the son and namesake of an ousted dictator that has been decades in the making. The Commission on Election, COMELEC, which said the poll was relatively peaceful, upheld its dismissals of complaints filed by different groups, including victims of martial law that had sought to disbar Marcos from the presidential race based on a 1995 tax evasion conviction. Marcos's runaway victory in Monday's election now looks certain, with about 98% of eligible ballots counted in an unofficial tally showing he has nearly 31 million votes, double that of Robredo. Well, an official result is expected around the end of the month.
In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, pulmonologist Joseph Varon offered an opinion that made headlines on social media and around the world. He said he was fighting 2 wars, one against COVID and one against stupidity. As the United States nears the grim milestone of 1 million coronavirus-linked deaths, Varon, chief of critical care and COVID-19 at United Memorial Medical Center in Houston, Texas, says only one of those battles has been won, and it's not human stupidity. According to federal data, COVID-19 infections are rising again in the United States, and around 66% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated. Most U.S. states and localities have eased mask and vaccination requirements. Some 58% of the U.S. population overall and more than 75% of the younger children have been infected with coronavirus since the start of the pandemic.
It's mind-blowing. I can't believe that we have lost a million people. Look at other countries. China has more than 1 billion people that live there. They didn't have a short percentage of the number of deaths that we have. I think that I have won the fight against the coronavirus. I think I've lost the fight against human stupidity. I think that people continue to do the wrong thing for whatever reason, whether it's a political reason or just don't believe on what's going on. That the reason why we have lost 1 million people in this country is because of that fight against human stupidity. I can tell you that the number of deaths that we would have been much more smaller if people just listened and did the right thing, if they had a little bit of common sense. It is frustrating. It is frustrating that things like social media makes people do things, or these influencers make people to do things that have absolutely no scientific basis. And that's, to me, when I see that a person dies because they did something stupid, it really feels bad. And I have seen it in other illnesses. You know, you see it with people that smoke and have lung cancer and stuff like that. But all of these patients showing up at the same time with the same problems, dying, it is very tough. It's like, gosh, I mean, why am I doing this? You know, it's like the definition of insanity. You keep on doing things over and over again. You're expecting a different result, but that's not happening.
We continue with monitoring of the COVID-19 pandemic. China's capital city, Beijing, has maintained tightened COVID-19 rules as it continues to fight a small but elusive outbreak in the city. In the largest district of Shaoyang, home to 3.45 million people, parks, stores, even shopping malls and restaurants are closed, while residents continue to participate in mass COVID-19 testing. In most severe restrictions imposed in Beijing so far, an area southwest of the capital has forbidden residents from leaving their neighborhoods and ordering all activities not related to virus prevention to a halt. Elsewhere, some residents have been told to work from home. Dine-in services at restaurants have been banned. Parks, small malls and other venues are also shut, and a significant chunk of public transport routes have been suspended. Beijing reported 61 new symptomatic coronavirus cases from May 9th. That's up from 33 a day earlier.
Australian police have launched a probe after 50 kilograms of suspected cocaine, estimated to be worth about $20 million, was found near the body of a diver washed up on a riverbank in New South Wales state. A man wearing high-end diving equipment was found lying unconscious near to the Hunter River at Newcastle. That's about 170 kilometres north of Sydney. According to New South Wales Police, several packages which contained a white powder believed to be cocaine were located near the body. The police have not yet identified the diver. Investigators searched an overseas registered ship docked near the crime scene and talked to the crew. Two small boats were reportedly seen floating near the vessel.
A large amount of what we believe are drugs were located not far. During inquiries and investigations of the area, a large amount of what we believe are drugs were located not far from the dead man, and inquiries are continuing as to where those drugs came from, whether this man had any links to it at all. The vicinity of the dead man was a large vessel registered overseas known as the Ariti, which had left from Argentina to travel to Australia.
The European Union coordinator for nuclear talks will be visiting Iran this week in a bid to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. According to Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Enrique Mora, Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service will meet Iran's chief negotiator Ali Bagheri Kani in the Iranian capital Tehran on Wednesday. He says Iran has been negotiating with the parties to remain in the deal following the United States withdrawal and has reached an agreement on the text of the deal. He also notes that Iran and the United States have been exchanging information indirectly through EU representatives. Mr. Khatibzadeh stressed that a pause in the Vienna talks is mainly due to a lack of resolve from the US side.
And a fresh spell of sweltering heat is sweeping across parts of northern India, including the capital, New Delhi, triggering water shortages, power cuts and heat strokes in its wake. Temperatures in New Delhi, which had subsided over the past few days, are back to dangerously hot levels once again. People living in New Delhi slums are among the first casualties of the weather, especially those who do not even have piped water supply in their houses and have to spend hours waiting for water trucks to procure their daily fix of water. Chandni Singh, a climate scientist and lead author of IPCC's assessment report on impact, adaptation and vulnerability, said extreme heat over a sustained period can have severely detrimental impact on health, ranging from heat strokes to death. She added that another pitfall of early and prolonged heat waves could see the spread of vector-borne diseases to newer regions.
And South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has held meetings with China's Vice President Wang Qishan and Singapore's President Halima Yacob after his inauguration in Seoul. President Yoon pledged further cooperation in various sectors between South Korea and the Asian nations during the talks, which was attended by both leaders after his inauguration ceremony. The 61-year-old president will face two major problems as he takes office: a belligerent North Korea testing nuclear weapons and inflation threatening to undermine an economic recovery from 2 years of COVID-19 gloom. President Yoon won a tight election in March as the standard bearer of the main conservative people power, less than a year after entering politics after a 26-year career as a prosecutor.
Staying in South Korea, thousands of visitors were seen flocking to the Blue House today as South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, opened it to the public on his inauguration day and relocated to a new office.
And known locally as Cheongwa Day, the former presidential compound in Seoul was open to the public for the first time in 74 years. President Yoon called the office a symbol of absolute power and says it will be used as a public park and cultural space.
President Yoon relocated to the presidential office to a former defense ministry building in the central district of Yongsan under a $40 million, which his predecessor Moon Jae-in criticized as rushed and a national security risk. People living nearby said they had mixed feelings about the move. There was a 39-year-old local resident who said that he was worried about possible protests, but also expected security in the area to improve at the same time.
That's right. His first day of the job today, President Yoon held a meeting with aides and appointed 7 cabinet nominees who had passed their confirmation hearings, including finance and defense ministers. He has also met with representatives from various countries, including the US, China, and Japan. Wish you could see those pictures, though.
Indeed.
Well, thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Millicent Walker. Have a good evening.